More than 3 months ago, Republican members of the United States Senate made a commitment. We made a commitment to each other and to our voters and to the American people. We agreed not to send one more penny of their hard-earned money overseas to support conflicts in foreign nations until their own homeland, America's own homeland, was secured. Well, through the efforts of a faithless few, we're poised to treat our promise to Americans the same way President Biden has treated his solemn oath to protect our country's borders: expedient, expendable, and now apparently expired. Madam President, we cannot send billions of dollars to Ukraine while America's own borders are bleeding. Heaven help us. The American people should not have to watch us every hour of every day, looking over our shoulder just to make sure that their own government doesn't stab them in the back. What have they done, after all, to deserve such contempt, such untrustworthy public servants? What grudge does this body hold against the very people who elected us? On Saturday, I spent many hours trying to make 6 different amendments to this legislation pending. Most of them, in fact, were germane to this bill. They dealt specifically with it and met the tight legal definition that we use in this body to decide whether it's pertinent to the bill, and it has certain procedural benefits and protections. If it is germane, most of mine were. And yet, again and again, I was shot down. I was told that Republicans had forfeited our right to offer any improvements, any changes to this bill, because we rejected the border proposal that we had received just a few days earlier, a week ago Sunday at 7 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. Now, my request was simple. It was not that each of my amendments be made law. No, it wasn't that. Nor was it even that I was asking that each of my amendments be included in the base text of the bill, be considered adopted as part of this, as an amendment. It wasn't that either. No, it was much, much simpler. It was that each amendment merely be permitted to be considered, debated, and possibly voted on. I came to the floor and asked consent to do this because the Senate Majority Leader, Chuck Schumer, had utilized a procedure that has unfortunately become all too common in this body, known as filling the tree. To make a long story short, to make a complicated system sound simpler, filling the tree is the means by which you say there is no space to consider amendments to this bill. We can't even make them pending because all the slots are full. And so majority leaders have, over the last few years, become increasingly fond of filling the tree. They'll plug in a handful of amendments to the proverbial tree. One amendment changing a comma into a semicolon. Another amendment changing a date, say from September 29th to September 30th. It's usually something fairly immaterial. They're just there as space fillers, as amendment blockers, so that the Senate can't consider other amendments. There's still ways around that, and I was exploring one of those ways. You come down to the floor, you call up your amendment, you ask consent to make your amendment pending and to set aside one of the tree filling, one of the amendment blocking amendments that have been put in there by the majority leader just in order to obstruct others from having the opportunity for amendments. And so that was the simple request, merely being permitted to have these amendments considered, debated, and possibly voted upon. I had a number of amendments. There were 7 I talked about that day. There were 6 I offered up and asked consent to have made pending. Here's some of what they would have accomplished. had we adopted them. One proposed to make discrete common sense changes to our immigration law in order to protect our border and to prevent traffickers from using toddlers and babies as a means to ensure that their customers would have, as a means to ensure their customers easy access into the interior of our country, notwithstanding the fact that they're entering our country illegally. That was, in fact, describes a few of my amendments. And I had at least one amendment that would make it very clear that an illegal alien who knowingly registers to vote will be subject to criminal penalties. Right now, it's nominally against the law to vote if you're not a citizen, but there are far too few teeth in that law. And this would provide some of those teeth. Now, who could be against making sure, especially when we've had record numbers of people entering our country without documentation, entering our country illegally? 10 million, according to some estimates. Some would say that it's higher than that. Some would say it's a little lower than that. Either way, we're talking about something in the neighborhood of 10 million or so entering into this country just since Joseph R. Biden became the 46th President of the United States on January 20th, 2021. It's not unreasonable as we approach a very important, very consequential election to say, let's make sure that it's citizens who are voting, and let's say that in the case of an illegal alien who knowingly registers to vote would face some penalties for that. These and other amendments that I had prepared would actually ensure border security and protect America's elections from foreign interference. Things that I think many, probably most of my colleagues profess to care about, things that we all certainly should care about. But nonetheless, these amendments drew objections. All of them objections imposed by Democrats in the Senate to the mere consideration of these amendments. We couldn't even make the amendment pending, couldn't even consider them. I also asked that the following amendments be considered. An amendment that would allow only 2% of the funds intended for Ukraine to be released until the President delivered a strategy to Congress with specific objectives and specific timelines. This, Madam President, is not too much to ask. Not too much to ask when we've already sent $113 billion over for that war effort, and when we've got a lot of additional funding that, if this bill is enacted, would also be sent to Ukraine. If we're going to do all this, and if we're going to put American weapons on the line, if we're going to put the additional strain on those who produce our weapons on the line, if we're going to reduce our stockpiles even further, if we're going to tax and inflate the dollar additionally, as this will require us to do because we're talking about borrowed money here, then the American people should have the benefit of knowing what the strategy is. We don't have a comprehensive, coherent strategy from the administration on what they want as the outcome of our efforts, of our assistance. What does this look like? How does this conflict get brought to a peaceful, lasting conclusion? What does Ukraine look like after that long hoped-for conclusion? These are reasonable things for us to expect. These are certainly reasonable things for us to debate, regardless of how eager any individual senator might be, or alternatively, how reluctant any individual senator might be about providing additional funding to Ukraine. There was another amendment prohibiting any funding for economic support for Ukraine from paying the pensions and the salaries of Ukrainian government bureaucrats, as well as paying for any Ukrainian welfare programs. We were pleased, of course, that the language of this bill contains a carve-out that prohibits the use of the roughly $8 billion we're sending over in economic support to the Ukrainian government, saying that it couldn't be used to shore up Ukrainian pensions. That was a good thing. We're glad to see that. We had feared that that would be in there. That was in the original proposal. That original suggestion by President Biden, it should be in there. And that economic relief package was originally somewhere in the neighborhood of $11 or $12 billion. It was brought down, I think, in part because of this prohibition against using it to back up pensions in Ukraine. But there's still nothing in there that prohibits Ukraine from using that for its own social welfare programs or to pay the salaries of Ukrainian bureaucrats or other civil servants. By the way, it's my understanding that this is enough money to pay them for an entire year. Now, a lot of Americans have questions, even a lot of Americans who might be okay with sending some additional military assistance to Ukraine, have reservations about paying the salaries and the social welfare benefits of the Ukrainian government for an entire year. There was another amendment that I tried to make pending that would prohibit putting American taxpayers on the hook for any reconstruction activities in Ukraine. It's understandable here, too, why there would be some concern. When we engage in nation building, this is often how an effort that begins with a promise that we'll be there for maybe a year or two, that we'll be in charge of reconstruction activities for a year or two, it can stretch into 2 decades really quickly before we know it. And unlike wars in Iraq and Afghanistan and other places where we've engaged in nation building that took way too long and way too much money from the American taxpayer, this isn't even a war that we ourselves are fighting. This isn't even a war as to which we've enacted an authorization for the use of military force for Americans to fight or a declaration of war. And so it makes it even more inappropriate for us to just assume that nation building is going to be our focus. Now, sure, there's only $25 million in this bill for that effort identified as such within that particular project of newly liberated communities or words to that effect. But this is the nose in the camel's tent. Once that begins, and if this war concludes, where I think all of us in this body want it to conclude, which is a victory for Ukraine, there's going to be a lot more of this to go on. There was a recent estimate by some global authority, it could have been with the World Bank, suggesting we're looking at something like $300 or $400 billion for Ukrainian reconstruction. Why would the United States put itself in a position here to be on the cutting edge of that, to be at the epicenter of that, as far as organizing, funding, et cetera? It's a dangerous thing to move forward with without even having a debate on a single amendment to try to limit what we would do on that front. There was also an amendment that I tried to make pending that would clarify that not only would our American taxpayer dollars stop funding UNRWA, this singularly offensive anti-Semitic, anti-Israel agency within UN. And I'm here again, I'm grateful to those who drafted the bill that at least UNRWA was excluded from U.S. funding. Because UNRWA, as we've discovered in recent weeks, and as many of us have worried about for years, has been involved in all kinds of horrible things, not just the indoctrination of young children in Gaza, such that they were taught in UNRWA-run schools to hate Jewish people, but also encouraged to engage in acts of violence against them, and have been for years, in fact, the better part of a couple of decades. But more recently, it appears that number of UNRWA personnel and facilities and other resources were used actively to help these attacks and those responsible for the attacks. So anyway, it's a good thing that the bill as written excludes UNRWA. But what about the other agencies? I believe there are 19 UN agencies operating within Gaza. What about those? So my amendment that I introduced last week and that I tried to make pending on Saturday would clarify that not only would U.S. taxpayer dollars not be available to send to UNRWA specifically, but they would also no longer fund any UN organization, any UN agency operating in Gaza, ensuring that the American taxpayer dollar does not end up in the hands of Hamas. Look, these UN networks are very sophisticated, and those that operate in Gaza have, of course, worked closely in concert one with another. And to say that we're going to get rid of any risk of funding the same problems that were facilitated and materially advanced by UNRWA in the past just by funneling them through another UN agency is folly. And to suggest that simply by funneling it through the UN to send aid to Gaza, we're somehow going to prevent any situation in which we materially assist Hamas, it's not going to happen. I mean, look, it's difficult for us to grasp this here because, fortunately, those who have grown up in this country and lived here our whole lives have never experienced anything like Gaza, present day, 21st century Gaza, in which there is no state. To say it's a failed state is almost an insult to failed states everywhere. But this is just a failure at every end. There essentially is no state. And yet, in part because there is no state, and because of the way that it rules, Hamas rules Gaza with an iron fist. Iron fist in glove. It is in control of everything. So no matter who you funnel it through, even if you don't funnel it through UNRWA, because you can't under the text of this bill, you give it to some other UN entity, it's still going to be helping Hamas, and we don't want to do that. We know that October 7th, absolutely grisly. It was a sobering wake-up call to all who have witnessed it. And for those of us who have visited those areas in Israel, in southern Israel, next to Gaza, as my wife and I have in recent weeks, it is sobering, heartbreaking, breathtaking. There are not enough adjectives associated with misery and shock and horror to describe the atrocities that were carried out that awful day on October 7th. And yet, October 7th is and was the tip of the iceberg compared to what they have planned. What they have planned, what they want to do, what Hamas and other Iranian proxies want to do in the region and will do when given the chance will make what happened on October 7th look like a Sunday picnic. So we don't want to be funding that. Yet in two different accounts under this bill, there's money that could go there. There's two accounts added together, total between $9 and $10 billion. That ought to be something we're concerned about. And for my colleagues who might disagree with me on this amendment, I would ask them this: shouldn't this at least be something that we should debate? Shouldn't this at least be something we should vote on before we send it? This, like the other amendments that I've just described, the other germane amendments that I've just described, they are not dilatory, these are not reckless, these are not there to try to serve any purpose other than to, number one, make the bill less likely to inflict harm, which I think should be our first job in all of this, and also to sharpen the debate, sharpen our analysis of what it is that we want to happen. It's not too much to ask for those things to be considered. But disturbingly, my colleagues, those of them who objected and those who have supported the objectors and those who have supported cloture, even after it became clear that there was to be no debate on any of these things, have persisted in moving forward and have defended those who have done it, defended those who have ensured that we will have no meaningful debate on any of these issues, no opportunity to vote. They've rejected every safeguard, every limit, every condition that I've offered so that we may, if we adopted them, I think these are things we could do to make sure that we're good and faithful stewards over U.S. taxpayer dollars. And, you know, these taxes that we spend all too freely here are not free. They're taken from hardworking citizens. They're taken from hardworking men and women who are just trying to put a roof over their head and food on the table, finding these days that since January 20th, 2021, it costs them $1,000 a month every single month just to put food on the table, gas in the car, groceries in the fridge, in the pantry, just to live. Everything from housing to health care, from gas to groceries, everything in between. It's all become more expensive, in large part, mostly, because our government spends routinely trillions of dollars a year now, more than it takes in every single year. And you can't do that, even when you're the world's reserve currency, which the US dollar is. By the way, we should worry about whether we're jeopardizing that too. So far, we've gotten away with it because the dollar is still the least bad deal in town. And by in town, I mean on the planet. But the more we test the limits of that, the more I think we shouldn't test the limits of it. But in any event, even when you are the world's reserve currency, there's still consequences to multi-trillion-dollar deficit spending year after year after year. It's one thing to do that in the middle of a pandemic. We now should doubt the wisdom of a lot of that, but especially because it then led to a pattern of multi-trillion-dollar deficit spending year after year since then, including this year, including times like now when we're kind of at the peak of an economic cycle. We've got really low, often record low, unemployment as we've been doing this. You print and borrow and spend that much money all at once. It has the effect of just printing it. Every dollar buys less. So through the combination of taxes that many American families work weeks out of months, or if not months, often months out of every year just to pay their federal taxes. On top of that, they're taxed again when every dollar they make or have saved buys a lot less precisely because we borrow and spend too much money. And you add insult to injury to that. After making them work that long to make the money, after then taxing them again because you spent too much money, you make it so that their money doesn't spend as far, doesn't buy as much as it used to. You add insult to injury by not even debating an amendment to make sure that their hard-earned tax dollars aren't used to kill Israelis and threaten, intimidate, perhaps kill Americans and our allies. This is really concerning. I don't understand why we would want to do this. So, we've got to make sure that we've undertaken our due diligence work properly, that we've done so faithfully. If we don't do it, the American people will be disappointed, and they should be. Look, I've not been quiet about my opposition to this bill. I do believe it betrays a promise that, as I understood it, the members of the Senate Republican Conference made to each other and made to our constituents and made to our colleagues across the aisle and our counterparts over in the House a few months ago. A commitment that, as I understand it, was not just made months ago, but also reiterated pretty consistently over the last 2 or 3 months. And if we stayed to that, then this body wouldn't consider sending another dollar, another quarter, another dime, another nickel, another penny to Ukraine until we had passed something that actually would secure the border, that would force the issue of border security so that the issue of border security and a secure border could be realized in the near short term, in this presidency, and not at some aspirational moment somewhere in the future. We were told for months that this was the plan, and something was negotiated on that. And I have great affection and respect for those who were involved in that on both sides of the aisle. Senator Langford is a dear friend, and he worked really hard on that. I know the other negotiators did too. They were in that room, we weren't, and for many of us, most of us, in fact, I think it ended up being all but 4 Republican senators who, after we first saw that bill at 7 p.m. Eastern Standard Time a week ago Sunday, looked at and decided we couldn't support it. So once that happened, it didn't somehow expunge the previous commitment. It didn't release us from the obligation we had to each other and to our voters to try to make sure that before we sent another dime to Ukraine, that we make sure that this border is secure at home, that we force the issue of border security, even as against an administration led by a president not willing to secure the border. In fact, one that's openly hostile toward border security for reasons I cannot fathom. That's the position they're taking. Were there provisions in that bill that could have made a difference? Of course there were. There were things in that bill that I think could have proven useful within an administration that wanted to make the border secure. But with an administration bent on not doing that very thing that was the object of the entire months-long negotiation process to begin with, there were enough loopholes in it that I and nearly all of my colleagues didn't believe it got us to that point. So once that happened, I believe what could and should have happened was that we as Senate Republicans would unite again behind the idea of getting something done. Put a few things, concrete things on the table. Something like one of the amendments that I offered up the other day, my Stopping Border Surges Act, which would make some surgical adjustments to immigration law, particularly those dealing with border security issues. They're narrow, they're finite, they should be things that every Republican should be able to support. We presented that and a couple of other provisions. I know I've got a colleague or two who have expressed interest in, and I think a majority of Republicans who have indicated that they would support language that would even tie the spending of Ukraine aid to the achievement of certain objectively verifiable border security metrics. Others have suggested attaching legislation passed by the House to secure the border, H.R. 2. Not a bad idea, since we know that has the support of every Republican in the House of Representatives. Now, others have said, well, that's we know that can't pass in the Senate. Well, yeah, alone it couldn't. Alone, I think every Republican over here has expressed support, at least for the core provisions of that. And I think every Democrat has expressed opposition to it as a whole. But once you attach it to this and make it a conditioned precedent for sending another dime to Ukraine, that might change. The whole idea from the beginning was to harness the Democrats' overwhelming support for sending more Ukraine aid, combine that with Republicans' overwhelming support for securing the border. Neither party would perhaps be pleased with the outcome, and that it would involve giving up something that we didn't want to provide. But nonetheless, it'd be a way forward. So if we were standing by that, if 24 to 48 hours after the border deal, as it's been described in the public, was released to the public for the first time through the news media at 7 p.m. Eastern Standard Time a week ago Sunday, we knew within 24 to 48 hours it wasn't going anywhere. Within 72 hours, all but 4 Republicans had voted against it. Once that happened, the logical next step, consistent with the commitment that we made to each other and to the public months ago, would have been to negotiate something else, perhaps including something like H.R. 2, perhaps including something like what most Republicans have said they think would be appropriate in addition to that, which would be conditioning the release of Ukraine aid to the achievement of certain objectively verifiable border security metrics. But no, rather than having any of this, we had a handful of my Republican colleagues, 12.5 of them now, who have chosen to move ahead with the bill, to move ahead with the quid without the quo, to move ahead with what the Democrats want, what unites Democrats, not only Democrats in the Senate, but Democrats across the country, Democrats in the House, with what they want, but without Republicans having any of what they want, at least most Republicans. So you can understand my frustration here, that if we can't have the bill we want, the next best thing would be to at least have the chance to try to amend this bill. Without something that actually forces fully the issue of border security, it's hard for me to imagine how I could even consider voting for it. For my own purposes, to say nothing of the commitment that we as a conference made to each other and to the public months ago. But if I can't defeat the bill, the next best thing I can do is to amend it, to improve it. Now, some have cynically denigrated this by saying that a lot of those wanting to offer amendments are doing so merely for dilatory purposes, or doing so for purposes that are themselves cynical, trying to destroy the bill, and in any event, these are people who don't support the bill, are not going to vote for the bill at the end of the day, and therefore shouldn't get a chance to do so. I find this argument utterly lacking with 2+ centuries of established tradition to principles of basic collegiality that ought to pervade any body, much less certainly, at least any body that fancies itself the world's greatest deliberative legislative body. Think about it for a minute. If you say, unless you agree with this bill exactly as it is, and unless you are willing to agree to support the bill, regardless of which amendments pass and which do not, unless you're unequivocally willing to sign on to whatever becomes the finished product of this bill, we're not going to take into account your desire to have us consider amendments. You lose. You are excluded from the process. You're not part of the cool kids club, and you have no say in it. We won't even let you offer amendments, and when you try to do so, we will question the sincerity of your desire to do it. That's not fair. That's not accurate. And it completely ignores the way this or any other legislative body in any civilized society that I know anything about should operate. But look, the fact is that I and others have not been allowed to amend the bill, not just to amend it, to achieve the amendment, to achieve passage of the amendment. We haven't even been allowed to make a single amendment pending, thus putting it in line for eventual disposition, either by a roll call vote, a voice vote, a point of order, a motion to table, or any of the other myriad means by which an amendment once pending can be disposed of. None of my colleagues, neither Democrat nor Republican, have been allowed to amend it. Why not? Well, there is this misinformation circulating about why we can't amend the bill, so I'd like to correct the record. This morning it was reported by a Hill News outlet that, quote, there's still no agreement on amendment votes, in part because of Senator Rand Paul of Kentucky, close quote. Is that really what's happening? Honestly? Look, that same newsletter failed to note that I spent 4 hours on the floor on Saturday asking unanimous consent for 6 amendments merely to be made pending, not to pass them, not to have them adopted, merely to make them pending. I was not asking for these amendments to be passed or voted on immediately. I was just asking for them to be brought up before the Senate for consideration. The objector to my request was not Senator Paul, as this morning's reporting might have led you falsely to believe. Senator Paul was not the one blocking an amendment process. It was Senate Democrats who objected every single time to even considering any kind of amendment, even my germane amendments, which were most of the amendments that I tried to make pending. And again, a germane amendment is one that, under the rules of the Senate, is very closely connected, tightly, inextricably connected to the subject matter. It's not some extraneous thing. My Democrat colleagues said that, quote, MAGA extremists had their chance. This is what they said while objecting to the mere consideration of my amendments, implying that when Senate Republicans rejected the border bill that we saw for the first time at 7 p.m. Eastern Standard Time a week ago Sunday, that we forfeited our right to offer amendments of any sort, apparently not just amendments related to border security or immigration or whether or not we should allow illegal immigrants to vote without facing some sort of penalty, but also amendments regarding where exactly the money is going to Ukraine, whether they should be able to use it for their own social welfare programs, whether or not they should be able to use it as they have in the past under similar programs, under similar money that we've sent them in the past, to pay for concert tickets for Ukrainian concert goers, to pay for the economic stability of clothing stores in Ukraine, and to pay the salaries for one entire year for every single government employee of the Ukrainian government. When did that become the principle of this body? That because something like this happened, here that Republicans rejected, all but 4 of us, opposed the border bill that we saw for the first time a week ago Sunday at 7 p.m., we forfeited all of our rights to even offer any amendments and have those considered. When did that become the principle of this body? What insane human being commandeered our system and all of a sudden inserted that new rule? It's not in my rule book. It's not in any of the books that outline the precedents that have unfolded over the last 2.5 centuries in this country. No, not at all. When did we accept that if you disagree with the legislation before the Senate, you can't offer any amendments to make the bill better than it otherwise would be? Where is that written in the Senate rules? When did that become a custom of the Senate? I hope that my Republican colleagues would unite. If not on this bill, then at least unite to completely disavow this view to disabuse the press and anyone watching from thinking that this is how we roll now. We really should be able to unite to completely disavow this view. Why? Well, because it'll completely trample on the rights of the minority party and disenfranchise the voters who put us here to begin with. That's a really good reason. Really good reason to make clear that it doesn't matter where you're leaning on a bill or where you might vote on the ultimate package before the Senate. You still have no less a right to try to improve the bill, to try to make sure that it's better than it is now. But I'm afraid, Madam President, some of my Republican colleagues are entertaining this view. In fact, one of my Republican colleagues who's here in the chamber today reportedly said yesterday, and I hope that he was misquoted, quote, "You don't put forth 80 amendments and say that you won't negotiate on time agreements and be taken seriously. That's what's happening here. Those folks are going to vote against it no matter what," close quote. Look, maybe there's more to the context of this. I hope there is. Perhaps there's something I'm misunderstanding.
Senator from North Carolina.
I rise to see if the gentleman from Utah will yield with the knowledge that I will provide some of my unallocated time so he can continue his comments beyond that required to answer my questions.
Will the senator yield for a question?
Yeah, without surrendering the floor, I'll yield for a question.
Thank you, Senator Lee. Senator Lee, first, I want to thank you for putting forth amendments, many of which I would like to vote for. I also want to thank you for not having the proviso that all of these amendments must be voted for without yielding any time. But Senator Lee, you mentioned about how the Senate works. I've only been here for 9 years. You've been here longer than me. But I thought it was custom, whether Democrats were in control or Republicans were in control, that when we reached a point to where we're on the bill, that a part of the process was making good faith offers of amendments like you have. And then the majority, which actually controls what we take up on the floor, would then look for at least some concession on time. But I understand that we have some members who have said no matter what, they would not be conceding any time. So just to be fair to the couple of dozen people watching C-SPAN and some of the people in the gallery, I'm just trying to understand whether or not it is clear that we have members who said under no circumstances would we negotiate any time, and it's in fact that intransigence that's making it less likely that any of the good bills that my colleagues have offered up in the Republican conference are not going to get voted on. Is that your understanding?
Yes.
Okay.
I think so.
Okay. And so may I ask another question? So I just want to be clear that generally speaking, Senator Lee, I've observed you do some extraordinary things on the floor and managed to get some very helpful measures, amendments voted on, including some of the ones today. But I do want to be clear that we're likely never going to have an opportunity to vote on those, because we do have some of our colleagues who have made it very clear that they're not willing to have the puts and takes that are necessary in the world's most deliberative body to actually get an opportunity to take those votes. Is that your understanding?
Yes, essentially. I would like to respond. I hope to get the floor back soon to explain what I mean. Thank you. All right, so in the first place, yeah, you're right to point out, I have not been objecting to those. It is a common agreement and understanding that we'll reach. Not always, but much of the time we can pull together a list of amendments, put them together on a raft, so to speak, a raft that you can send out among all Senate Republicans, and if no one objects, you can vote on a handful. Maybe it's 4, maybe it's 40, maybe it's somewhere in between amendments, and then you'll set up some agreements surrounding the amount of time for each of those. I'm not sure of exactly all the details or all the reasons of those objecting, but I do understand there have been some of my colleagues who have objected to those. But I will say this. The fact that there are some who object to that, my understanding is that at least for some of them, I can't purport to speak for all of them, at least for some of them, what they were concerned about is making sure that any such raft of agreements not culminate in or create an expectation of a scenario in which we would limit the total number of amendments that could be offered, considered, and voted on, or the total amount of time in which amendments could be considered, and that on that basis they were objecting. Now, I didn't arbor that particular view and wasn't making those particular objections. Nonetheless, those colleagues were not objecting to what I was doing all day on the floor on Saturday, which is calling up again and again amendments, most of which were germane to the bill, that no one on the Republican side was objecting to, not one, to having them made pending. And the only reason given that I heard on Saturday as to why they weren't allowing amendments. And what's funny about this one is that the objection as it was made was usually occurring in response to something that had nothing to do with border security as far as my amendments went. The objection I got from the Democrats who objected over and over and over again was, look, MAGA Republicans are to blame, and they rejected the border package, therefore they don't get any say in this bill. So this is entirely afield from that objection. This is entirely afield from what my friend and colleague, and I mean that sincerely when I call him a friend from North Carolina, was mentioning. This is different than that. These were, nobody else was here. No other live requests were being made for people who wanted to make their amendments pending. There was no reason in the world why we couldn't at least make those pending. And the fact that, yeah, some were objecting to having them pass in blocks, that's their business. I can't answer for that. But they had their reasons, and they did not object to what I was doing there. And so it really leads me to wonder why it is that anyone would imply that if you don't support the final bill, you don't get any say in the bill. You can't make your amendments pending. You can't even have your amendments considered. You can't even tee them up for consideration, for disposal, as I say, either through a roll call vote or a voice vote, or alternatively a motion to table, a motion to commit, or a point of order, or something like that. You cannot make them pending, apparently, unless you swear allegiance to the finished product, which can't yet be seen, but you're asked to assume consists of that which has been foreordained by whatever a very, very small group of senators happen to be the privileged ones to have written that. Okay? I'd like to continue my remarks if I could.
If at the end of the, I would ask if at the end of Senator Lee's remarks, if he would yield to a question.
Senator from Utah actually has the floor, Senator.
My inquiry to Senator Lee was whether or not he would yield at the end of his comments for a question.
Will the senator yield for a question?
Go ahead and ask your question. At some point, I'd like to be able to continue my thoughts without being interrupted. Go ahead.
Madam President, I just want to make the point that I've actually seen a number of amendments that Senator Lee has made that I'd like to vote on, and I don't believe that there's anyone here who's making a judgment about whether or not he should get the amendments, whether or not he's going to vote for the final passage of the bill. I just want to restate again whether or not he's aware that we're not getting on any amendments, probably a handful that would be his, because of objections offered by our colleagues. And I just wanted to make that point. It has nothing to do with where he will ultimately vote on the bill. It has to do with the intransigence of some of our members who simply won't seek agreement, which is how we operate in the Senate. Thank you, Madam President. Thank you, Senator Lee.
Okay, a couple of things. First of all, it's still beside the point. I get that. I appreciate the observation made by my friend, my distinguished colleague, the senator from North Carolina. I really do. It still misses the point. I was still here. I still sought to have my amendments made pending on a half dozen amendments, most of which were germane, on Saturday. There was no reason why we couldn't make those pending. There was nobody objecting. The same senators who were objecting to other amendments were not objecting to these. And I don't know what that has to do with it. Secondly, It was my understanding when I agreed to entertain the first of those questions and to yield for a question that it would not count against my time, and I would ask consent that not.
Without objection.
All right. Madam President, I ask unanimous consent that any Republican senator be allowed to call up amendments and that the tree be set aside.
Do we have an objection? Objection is heard.
Madam President, I ask unanimous consent that any senator from either party be allowed to call up amendments and that the tree be set aside.
Is there objection? The
Madam
objection
President,
is heard.
I ask unanimous consent that any Democratic senator be allowed to call up amendments and the tree be set aside for that purpose.
Is there objection? Objection is heard.
Now, this is interesting. This is interesting what's happened. They're now opposed even to Democratic senators calling up amendments and making those pending. Why is that? Well, it appears to be, again, this consolidation of power. Look, the American people have lost enormous power in recent years, Madam President. They have lost enormous power as power has been taken away from them in at least 3 steps. First, it's taken away from them as power is brought away from states and local governments, where most of the power under our federal system is supposed to reside, consistent with both the original text of the Constitution and the 10th Amendment. Second, once that power has been brought here to Washington, it's been outsourced and moved away from the American people. And yet another step, lawmaking power gets shifted from elected lawmakers over to unelected, unaccountable bureaucrats. Third, even where the power resides and remains within this body, once it's been moved here, in many cases where it shouldn't be, it's been consolidated excessively to a few. Here in the Senate, I often refer to this as the firm, the law firm of Schumer and McConnell. Very often we consolidate power in the hands of the few. Legislative leaders put together a bill very much like this. In fact, this very bill. And then nobody allows, apparently by agreement, for anybody to get votes on anything. Even when we try to throw it open, we try to say anybody in this body gets to have their amendments made pending. They're told no. And then even after we make a request that just Democratic senators have that time, they're told no. Look, this is not how it's supposed to work. This is not how it's supposed to work at all. The American people are excluded from a process insofar as we all point to someone else. The American people must not be excluded from this process. And when they are, bad things happen. Today, this might be a bill that you like. Tomorrow, it might be a bill you don't like. Majorities can change. Republican Senate leadership within the Senate may change, and when it changes, you might not like the precedent that you yourself have set when you try to exclude people just because they disagree with your ultimate outcome of the bill. This isn't right. The Senate was set up to be a different sort of deliberative legislative body. Part of what makes it deliberative is that each state is represented equally, and there's a type of comity that naturally arises out of that understanding of what differentiates us from the House. A type of comity that survived and thrived for more than 2 centuries. It's been eroded materially in recent years. And by recent years, I mean very recent years. It's gotten significantly worse, even in the 13 short years that I've spent in the United States Senate. I hope we can turn it around. Madam President, may I ask how much time remains on my account after the deduction for the interruption?
The senator has 8 minutes remaining.
Okay. Seeing that I have 8 minutes remaining, I'd like to reserve the balance of those minutes so that I can come back as necessary. Thank you.